So if, you know, if I'm interested in something, like I literally just email people, and ask them. I don't have to like pitch it to an editor first and get permission to do that. Or, I like flew myself to Formula One this year because I wanted to find stories there in Miami. And like, I didn't have to like be the official New York Times like reporter there, and so I love choosing that. And I love, I do get assigned quite a few stories now, but I love choosing my topics, and I love choosing even more than the topics, I love choosing which editors to work with. Like you can really like choose who gets you and who you vibe with, and like who challenges you. And for me also, I write across like sections, which is not something I could do if I was a staff writer. So all that freedom, I think is incredible. And I mean, there definitely are downsides. I think like for me, it's not, I mean, the downside is you have no job security in theory. I mean, I personally have found that I haven't ever had trouble getting work. I have trouble getting the check sometimes. Like sometimes it like takes a long time to get money that you're owed, and that's always been a problem. But as far as I think there's a lot of work out there if you know how to find it. So that's been good. But another downside is you don't really have I don't really have like a career path or like a boss or a mentor who's like helping me to get to the next step. Like I'm kind of on my own, and I learn through my editors always edit my pieces, and then I get better through it. But I don't have anybody like meeting with me and reviewing me at the end of every quarter, or so I'm kind of I always wonder like what that would feel like to have an institution challenging you, as opposed to.
Well, I mean, you guys are both in a position now where you're able to pitch, and you feel, I mean, I don't know if anyone ever feels totally comfortable pitching, but I want to like bring us back to when you guys were both starting out pitching. Cause I think sometimes, I mean, for a lot of students too, we're just like, but how do I even start? How do I start? How do I know if my idea is good enough? Is it ready to pitch? Like, is there something, I mean, there are lots of things we can talk about, but we should start with, when you have an idea, at what point do you feel it's ready to pitch? Like, you feel like you both had very different views on this. And I think it was like so interesting to me. I guess either one can go. Liz, do you want to go?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think at the beginning, it's all about starting small. So I remember being in Lit Rep and I couldn't think of a story idea for class. And I went up to the roof of my apartment building in Brooklyn and just like kind of emo, like I can't think of anything. And then I found a guy on the roof who was training pigeons to race, which is a very popular sport worldwide. And I talked to him for a while and I was like, oh my God, this is totally a story. So I pitched it to Vice and they took it for their online, for their website. And it was basically the story of this guy and also like the wider sport in New York and kind of like the underground pigeon racing scene, which is like not something I would normally cover, but it just was like in my neighborhood. And I'm sure a lot of you at NYU journalism are finding stories that way, like right in your neighborhood. But I think at the beginning, it's really important to start small. Like you don't have to try to do some big takeout feature on anything. Like just get your feet wet with something you feel comfortable with, some like a subject you know about. And then, over time, I had such a bad experience with doing aggregation, quick hit journalism that I went fully the other direction. And now almost all of my journalism, I take years to do it. So I've probably only published one short thing this year, but it's because the majority of the stuff I'm doing, it takes me 1 to 5 years to do, like whether it's a documentary or a podcast or a magazine piece or a book. And I'm really into doing like long form immersion journalism. If some of you have taken like Ted Conover's class where you're fully immersed with your subjects. But I think it took me like a really long time to work up to that. And yeah, I think with pitching in the beginning, it's helpful to just start small and then build from there and really find an editor, do a good job for them, and then build a relationship with them so you can keep pitching them again and again. Like I'm actually somewhat of an abrasive person. So sometimes I'll just be like, I didn't like that editor, like peace out, I don't want to work with you again. But actually that's not the way to do it. And, you know, as much as you can build a relationship, and I don't know, I think the hardest thing is really for a lot of people finding your ideas. But I guess the last thing that I'll say about that is it really helped me once I established a specific beat. So I was writing about everything from pigeon racing to homelessness in New York to immigration. Like I just was kind of all over the map. And then as soon as I started to focus, which my focus is now on kind of the intersection of stories about women and justice, I'm writing a huge array of stories, but I have like somewhat of a focus so that I constantly am finding more story ideas and more pitches, because one story on one beat leads to another. And I think I would encourage that for almost anyone doing freelancing, is just to like carve out some kind of a niche. Like we all know about the idea of beats, but I can't emphasize enough how the moment that I established a beat, my job got so much easier because one story just led to the next.
And editors probably come to you asking for ideas, right?
Yeah, I mean, before they were like, we don't really know what you do, but yeah, we'll keep you in mind. And now it's like, oh, it's a woman who killed her abuser. Are you open to doing this story? And unfortunately, I'm like, yeah, I've covered that story many times and I can do it. And I also just love having an expertise. You know, it feels good to be like, I know what I'm talking about. And like, yeah, I'm totally well equipped to do this story. So.
And yeah, that was one of my questions, is like, how is that you both sort of created beats. And Alyson, what do you sort of approach pitching in a different way, but if you could also talk about your like creating a beat too, that would be great.
Yeah, I'm just laughing because I still feel like I don't have a beat. Like I still feel like no one knows what I do, but
I feel like you have a beat.
I do too.
Lifestyle, you know, I would say all my stories are like lifestyle, you know, ish, you know, yeah. whether they're like business or, you know, but there's not like one topic that I'm an expert in, but I will say like I'm a much more emotional pitcher. Like I'll just like be talking to my friends and hear something crazy and like shoot it off to my editors without even doing research on it, which is probably not the right thing to do, but you know, but I'll be clear about that. You know, I'll just be like, I just heard the craziest thing, you know, like I think we should explore this. Or, you know, for example, like I went to a 9/11 memorial somewhere, and the Queen of England had just died, and they had Luke Parker Bowles, who's Camilla's nephew, come and do like say something for the Queen at this memorial service. And I was like texting my editor, like Camilla's nephew lives in New York and he's a filmmaker, and like, you know, I think we should like do something when it feels appropriate, you know. And so that I'm a much more like impulsive, emotional pitcher. And then, but again, I'll be very clear about it. You know, I'll be like, I've done no research. Like if you're interested, I'll come, you know, let me like look it up and make sure this is actually a thing. And, but I definitely get my ideas, you know, very like, I literally get a feeling in my stomach. You know, I can't, and I don't know how to teach that. Like, it's just what happens to me. I just feel it in my stomach, and I'm like, this is so good.
And these are editors that you have a relationship with already. Yeah. And what do you do for new editors? Are you ever like, I really want to get in this publication and I'm going to find this editor? I mean, we'll talk about some of the nitty gritty stuff, but how do you approach a pitch in that when it comes to that? Or do you just
a little more formally, like I'll just introduce myself. I'll say like, you know, hi, I'm Alyson Krueger. You know, I've written for these publications. Like I have an idea that I think will be good for your publication. But I will say, I think it's really hard to break into, for me personally, like I find it very, like Liz said, she likes having expertise. Like I like having a publication because every publication has different, you know, even just the way they write is different. The way they pitch is different. Like some publications have like, they want you to only submit it in writing and they have a format, and, you know, as opposed to like, I know now that like the New York Times style section has like 10 different editors, and one really cares about family stuff and one really cares about nightlife stuff. And they have a pitch meeting on Tuesday and Thursday. So I have to get my pitches in before that. You know, it's nice to take your time with a publication and like figure out how they work, you know, because then you're much more likely to succeed with your pitching, I think, because a lot of it is just how, some publications are assigning their stories like 3 months in advance. And then I have some publications who are open to writing about something that's happening like 2 days from now, and some publications are willing to move stories around if there's something newsy. Some are like very set in stone. Like even if, even if there's like a hurricane, they won't move their lineup, so like learning that kind of stuff over time has been very helpful for me. So that's why I really don't pitch that much to new publications. And I realize I'm in a very privileged position to be able to, to have enough work with the ones that I do work for.
Yeah, well, the first piece you ran was for the New York Times. So then you're like, well, I got my publication. That's a good one.
Yeah. And it really like suits me. Like and I think it's also important to find the publication that suits you. Like tried to do a piece for New York Mag, and it was a disaster because they have this like cool voice that I just don't have. Like I'm very like factual, what I like I'm not being humble. Like I'm not the world's best writer. Do you know what I mean? I'm a great reporter. Like I'm great with coming up with story ideas, but I'm not like this like flowery, incredible, moving writer. But the New York Times works for me because it's actually very formulaic. And they actually want you to use simple language. But if you're like edgier, then you might want to look at like New York Magazine or Vice or, and see who matches your tone a little bit.
Yeah. Well, and some students are sort of, I think it's like, but how do I even start to find a beat, And I think some of it's just like what you're interested in, what you're drawn to. But yeah, if you could speak to that, that would be, because I think sometimes they're like, I can write about anything, and it's like, that's hard. That's a hard position to be in.
It sounds like Liz and I both kind of fell into a beat. Like, I think you just write a lot and then you see what interests you. Like I really like to write about what's happening around me, like what's happening to my friends, what's happening in my neighborhood, what's happening, like I really like to be like a real person, report to the point that like sometimes now I get celebrity interviews and I can't stand it because it's like it's actually like so boring to me. Like I love writing about, they're like so buttoned up, but I love writing about like what is like, the person who lives 2 doors down from me going through, and, what's the new trend that real people are having. And, but I guess I fell into that by accident. I just started writing about what was around me. I don't know. Liz can really answer that because she has like a real beat.
No. I think your beat just finds you, actually. It might take some time. I wasn't even trying to have a beat, but I realized when I wrote this book about marriage that it was actually a book about women. And I think over time, it just sort of became clear that a lot of stories that I was writing about something else were actually about women's issues and issues around justice. I don't know. I think all of us have things inside of us that we care deeply about, and journalists pretend to be objective, but at the end of the day, there are certain subjects that you care about more deeply. And I don't know if that makes you not objective, because of course you still have to be fair in every sense of the word, but there's just stuff that you want to explore and that you care about. And there's a reason for that, either because of your experience as a kid or growing up, or the kind of personality you have, or things you've observed in the world. And I just think it's like really important to connect with that like deep down part of yourself. And that is how you become like a really good and effective and like, I don't know, a journalist who's like really feels meaning in your work, is like connecting with that voice that you have about that subject that you really care about.
Yeah. And I think, some things, some students come in and they have ideas about like certain people or certain, someone they met or something. And I'm like, well, what is the bigger takeaway? Or, is there some aspect that you sort of like the best story ideas are specific and universal at the same time? And, how do you think through finding that? I think sometimes you can get sort of focused in on just like what this is happening for this one person. And there is always some bigger, it's a struggle, a class struggle or money or whatever, or love, or, like they're bigger things. I mean, do you think big and small at the same time? And how do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think every story is about something bigger. I do it like, I very firmly believe that, and I think this is why I come up with so many trend stories. Like, I really believe that nothing is just happening to one person. Like, even if one person is doing the craziest things, like you can find other people doing them too. No one is that insular in this world that they're the only ones doing something. But I really think like I try to pay, sometimes if I'm not sure if a story is like a good story, like I might be interested in something, and then I'll like run it by my friends and see how long they talk about it at dinner. You know what, like, if they're still interested after 5 minutes, and to me that signals, and then I'll like test it out on my mom, and see if like she's excited about it. And then, to me that means like if multiple different groups in your life are spending time thinking about something, there has to be a deeper meaning to it, because, so
Yeah.
sometimes I'll do like little tests like that. And
Like a
or
real
I'll
focus
look,
group.
yeah, or like, I'll like see something and then I'll look online to see if I can get like hear strangers saying the same things. And then I think, you do have to kind of pull back and be like, what does this mean? Like I just wrote this story on over the summer about these like nannies in Spain and Greece that will stay with your kids all night while you party, and then while you're hungover the next morning. And like that's like a silly, like it's kind of a funny story.
Yeah.
Like, but the deeper story is like there's a new generation of parents who don't want to give up their old life and are finding a way to make it work, and like there's a pandemic element to that where they've been cooped up and they're, it is like, that's a bigger, like I knew that story was going to get like be polarizing. Like half the people were going to think these parents were the most incredible people, and like it was going to make them want to have kids, and the other half is going to be like these parents are irresponsible. But it's a bigger story about like what does being a parent mean? Like what's appropriate behavior for a parent? Like what do parents want? So everything is always a little deeper in my mind if you just like ask yourself like, well, what is really important about this? Like what are the bigger questions?
Yeah, and I think like looking at what is happening now. So I've done like several stories now of women who killed their abusers, and I got to the point where I was like, I don't want to cover this anymore, partly because it's like just so upsetting on so many levels to cover like domestic and sexual violence, but also because I felt like I was telling the same story. But I realized like the latest story that I'm covering, like it's actually not about that. Like that's the thread of the story. And one of the good things about covering court cases is there's a beginning, middle, and end. And I think actually covering a court case can be a good thing for a new freelancer to do, because you attend it, you learn how to get court documents and case files and work with like a court clerk and all these things, and interview lawyers and the defendants themselves, and you get to just, I don't know, it's a way to easily structure a story. But I realized as I was following this woman's case is the thing that's happening right now in her case, and this is a story that I was gonna write for a magazine piece, but I decided to just go straight to the podcast route. And so we're making this podcast about this woman who killed her abuser in Alabama, and she's been in prison for 5 years, and she was up for parole and she got denied. And then we looked into the parole system in Alabama, and they're actually violating their own guidelines of when to parole people. And people are saying that they're not paroling folks because they're trying to build new prisons. And if there aren't overcrowding in prison, they don't have a reason to build new prisons. So they're denying people parole just to build new prisons. So that's a really disturbing and urgent and current story. And then this week in Alabama, there were prison sit-ins at every prison across Alabama because people were protesting the fact that they weren't getting out on parole. So the story was about this one thing, but now it's evolving to this other more urgent thing. And I think a lot of times as you follow stories, I think just allowing the idea, I'm sure you've all heard this and thought about it, but like truly allowing the idea to morph in whatever way is most current, like especially if you're doing a long form story, like maybe you even pitch it as this woman killed her abuser in Alabama and she got 15 years in prison. But then as you're doing it, you're saying like, actually the way that we can most move the needle on the discussion around this issue is this parole system issue. And so now the story is evolving into this other thing and just allowing it to move, and I think editors really respect that too, when you say like, this is how this is changing and that's what it's going to be now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also say like my editors blow my stories up all the time. Like they're so good. I'll pitch like a tiny story and they'll be like, no, we're gonna write like this bigger thing about it. So sometimes they're even thinking bigger than I am, and which is always great. And then I tried it next time. I'm like, okay, is there anything bigger I could do with this story? Because I don't want them to blow it up for me. I'd rather do it myself.
Yeah. Well, one thing that you were saying that I thought was so interesting about your like last week Alyson, was that, so you were in London for a wedding or something, right? And so you're like, I want to find stories about the Queen. And so, I think, I'm always like, find the story that's like unique, or the only story that the story that only you could tell. But sort of that was a different way of looking at story. Like, you're like, this is a story that everyone is throwing all the resources at. And how did you go about finding, because you ran several stories, and I was like, how did you go about finding a story that was unique enough that other people aren't covering? And you said you were, what was it? You were working with the Times, right? But I did see some other, like there was a horse, like someone
I ended up so I had a wedding, and then the Queen, like right before I went to London for this wedding, the Queen died. So I was like, I also, by the way, always try to find a story when I'm traveling, because I don't, like, as a freelancer, you don't get paid time off, so it's always good to like make a little money, but it's also, it's interesting, and there's tax benefits. You can like tax deduct some of your trip if you're working while you're on the trip. So my backstory is I always try to find a story, but this time, like, I really wanted one because the Queen had just died. And I actually ended up pitching a few things to the Times, and it just didn't work out. Like, I would say sometimes that is a negative for me as a freelancer, is like when really big stories take place, like they put like a news desk on it, and it's like not even my editors are in control of it anymore. Like sometimes like the huge stories, like they don't let freelancers in on because they just have like a team.
Yeah.
So I tried a few angles with the Times, and like nothing was quite sticking, and like my editors weren't really aware of what other editors were doing, so they were trying to like, so anyways, I ended up I met once a long time ago at a tennis match. I met the royal editor of People magazine, so I texted her, and I was like, hey, I'm in London if you need an extra hand, and like didn't think she did, because People is like all about the royals. They have a huge team. And she was like, my team is dying, like they haven't slept in a week, like we would love your help, and then they actually sent me to places
Okay.
but even that was like kind of stressful, because like they kind of assigned me places, but then it was up to me to find stories once I got there. So I was assigned like on the day of the Queen's funeral, like they were like, can you go and hang out with the Queen's horses before they're in the procession? And I was like, is this like a loser assignment? Like, I just wasn't sure, I didn't know what I was but I didn't really have a choice. I was like, yeah, of course. And they were like, oh, by the way, you have to be there like 6 a.m. And I was like, okay, I'm gonna go interview horses at 6 a.m. But it turns out like I was at like the household cavalry, which is the monarch's personal army. And it was fascinating, like everything they were telling me about, like the meaning behind the uniforms. And they had spent 4 days like polishing their uniforms, and the horses were actually on vacation in the countryside when the Queen died, and they had to be called back from vacation. And and then they closed down the street, and then I ended up getting stuck there. I couldn't leave, and so I ended up talking to soldiers even more. And they told me like people always faint during this, so they increased their salt intake before the procession. So, and I ended up getting like tons of stories, maybe more than the other stringers, just because I was like stuck in a room with these soldiers, but it was fun, and I was getting paid either way, but I did kind of get a little competitive, like, oh, how many of my stories are they going to publish, that like I'm finding, because they had like 10 other people, other places. But yeah, I think for me, it's really just listening. Like, it's training your ears, no matter where you are. Like, I've gotten stories on the subway. I've gotten stories at events. I've gotten stories like as synagogue. I've gotten stories like just like listening to things in a different way. And like, for me, it was like every time I became interested in stuff, then the next question was like, is there a story here?
Mm-hmm.
Like, like in training, and I'm still not that good at it. Sometimes I miss things that I knew about. Like, I'll read an article and I'll be like, I thought that was interesting 4 months ago, and I didn't go to that next step of is this a story? So I don't know. Did I answer? That was a long-winded.
No, that was really helpful. I mean, and yeah, I bet you're sort of coming at it differently, Liz.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, I mean,
maybe it's the same.
part?
It's like, it's what's interesting. It's like, or what sort of, you're like, wait, this happened? I don't know.
Yeah.
And how do you train yourself for that? I don't even know if you can teach that, but.
Yeah, I think relying on the people who are doing the work on the ground, especially if you're covering social issues. So if you're covering something like justice issues or immigration or homelessness or any of these social issues, I think, and this can really apply to anything, but getting experts that you make relationships with, whether they're lawyers or work for a nonprofit, and just saying like, hey, what's going on right now? Like, what is the latest? And I think like something that I've observed a lot is that younger journalists or newer journalists are relying a lot on the internet. And that to me, once something is on the internet, it's almost no longer a story because that means people already know about it. It's already on the internet. The places that stories live that people don't know about are in the heads of the people who are doing the work on the ground. So I think like the number one way to do interesting stories that people don't know about is by connecting with people in whatever field it is you're covering and just being like, hey, what's new? Like, what do you wish journalists were covering that they're not covering? What are you seeing that people aren't talking about? Like, what is totally outrageous that's going on? What are you having nightmares about at night? Like, whatever it is, just like, and, you know, going out to coffee with these people or talking to them on the phone, and just explaining them the kind of stories you're trying to do and what you're interested in knowing more about. I think that is always the place to start, because lawyers know about tons of cases. People working nonprofits know so many people's life stories that are like wildly interesting, and they know things that are changing and social change that's happening in the country that people aren't before people are talking about it. And in terms of knowing whether it's an actual story that works, I think a lot of it for me lately is finding subjects that you want to hang out with. Because if you want to hang out with them, then the reader is likely to want to hang out with them. There's a lot of people that you could write about that you might not want to hang out with. And that doesn't mean there have to be some kind of perfect person. In fact, you know, we're all flawed, so it's better if you show that they're flawed. But just like the kind of person that you want to hang out with for like days or weeks or months on end, and have the reader come along for the ride.
Who are honest and retrospective.
Yeah, I've been dealing with a lot of unreliable narrators because most of the people I interview have complex PTSD. So that can often come, or, you know, dealing with mental health or addiction challenges, and that can often come with not being totally honest. So that's a whole other challenge, but I think like, yeah, finding more reliable narrators is always better.
That's a whole another panel. But yes, yeah. I wanted to talk about sort of shift into the business side a little bit. And then I also want to talk like some nitty gritty details that I get asked about a lot. So I'm wondering, how many ideas do you have going at once? Like to make freelancing work for you financially, you know, career-wise and all of that. Like, are you working on 15 ideas at once? Are you going one at a time? Yeah. How do you approach that? And like, I thought it was interesting, Alyson, you're like, every time I go somewhere, I'm like, find an idea. So,
yeah, I kind of create like personal, I think Whitney, you said it like this, you said it, like I create little personal challenges. Like, what story idea, you know, like the US Open's coming up, like what story idea can I come up with? Or, you know, it's this morning, sometimes when I get stuck, I try to think about like what's happening in the world, you know? So this morning, actually, I was trying to think like, what are the bigger topics happening right now? And I was like, okay, there was a hurricane, but that's probably covered, you know, it's not really New York enough and it's covered, but there's football. People are watching football again. There's back to school. There's the high holidays. There's fall, you know, like seasons. There's climate change still going on. We just finished fashion week, you know, ski season's about to, like, I try to just make a list of all the things that are happening and then see if I can come up with like an interesting angle with all of them. But I really kind of try to have, I try to have like one story per section I write for going at a time. I know that's not really helpful, but like, I like to have like one business story, one New York story, and then like 2 or 3 style section stories. Cause I work with different editors in the style section, you know, so I kind of try to have like something going with everybody I work with at all times. Because then for me, it's like, it's a volume game, you know, because you know, I'm getting paid like $1,000 to $2,000 per article. So, you know, and some months are more expensive than others. And, but it takes a while, you know, it takes a while to like pitch a story, get it accepted, have it run, get paid. You know, that whole process can take like a month or 2 months. So I always want to have things going, like, even if I don't need it right now necessarily, like you kind of have to be thinking like a month or two ahead.
Yeah.
And then
so you are thinking about what's next a lot.
yeah, totally. And yeah, and I try to be better about like thinking a little bit ahead editorially too. Like I'm like very last minute, but sometimes like it just something won't be on my radar, and then I'll like miss it. So now I'm like, okay, what's happening? Like not in October, like what's happening in November, or like what's happening at the holidays. Although sometimes it backfires on me if I go too far early, because then the editors just aren't ready to think about it either. And then I also think like most freelancers that I know that do stories like me have some sort of like side gig or something. And like mine is I went to Penn undergrad and I write for the Penn Alumni Magazine, and they pay like $3,000 an article. So and it's quarterly. So I try to have like one story with the Penn Gazette at all times. But like it takes like 4 months for that to get published. But that's like for me a nice backbone to have, and then everything else can like supplement it after that.
Yeah.
So, and I know some writers who do like copywriting, on their free time, or tutoring. Like when I first started freelancing, I was a tutor for people's bar and bat mitzvahs, and I was like making so much money. It was so boring. Like it wasn't good for my career at all, but it kind of gave me the luxury of like trying to build my career,
Yeah.
So people like Airbnb their apartment, like a lot of people have some sort of side thing when they first start off until they don't need it anymore.
And Liz, how many ideas do you have? Because you said you sometimes work on ideas for a year. So
yeah.
I wish I only had one idea at a time, because I hate having my brain fragmented. But I think one thing I've learned is to keep certain projects for certain parts of the day. Like these 4 hours I'm working on my book, the 4 hours in the afternoon I'm working on this magazine piece, just to try to have some disconnect. But like right now, for example, my book is due in a month. I have this podcast that's probably going to come out in April, and then I finished the documentary that's coming out in November, and I'm starting another documentary. So that's 4 ideas. And then there's also a magazine piece I wrote that I'm gonna get around to pitching, or like that I've reported. But I hate that. That's like way too many ideas. I personally think the less you can have, the better, if you can financially make it work. I think I got like excited to have my work be in other mediums, like, oh, this is so great that I can write a magazine piece, and then I can report on that issue again for a bigger audience on Netflix or whatever the case might be. But it's actually turned my brain into mush. So I think like my first book, I was bartending on the side. And that was way better, because I was literally not taking any assignments. I was like, my mind is precious. I must write this book and only think about this book. And I just bartended, and then I wrote the book. And I honestly think my brain was much better for it. So it really depends. I feel like there's so many career paths for a freelancer. Like there's what Alyson is doing, where the pieces are shorter and you're doing more of them. There's what I'm doing, where the pieces are longer and you're doing less of them. There's an in between. But it really is like just trying to figure out how to cobble those things together and pay your rent at the end of the day. And sometimes some years are better financially and some years are worse financially, and you save up for the worst year. But I don't know. I think the less ideas you can have going at a time are the better, just because then your brain isn't fragmented and you do a better job. But it's hard.
It really just is your person. Like I love having multiple things going at once. I find it like takes the stress. Like I always think my job is kind of like being in school. Like you have like 5 classes, you know what I mean? And you've got like papers due and exams, and like you just have to figure out when to do it all. But I know some people who like hate that, and I know some people who are like, I'm writing like probably 4 or 5, 6 pieces a month. Like I know some people who are writing like, like 10 stories a week that are like smaller, like 300 ones, and they probably are making like even way more money than me. But I personally couldn't go there. That feels too much for me. So you just have to know your brain, and like what you can handle and what works for you,
Some students come in, you mentioned money, like some people are like, oh, how do I tell them how much I want to be paid? And in my experience as an editor, there was a rate, we were like, this is our rate. and it was always lower than the person wanted, and you had and so, but I had worked at bigger places. So how do you guys handle the rate talk? Do you go in and say, I only get paid $1 a word, or you just like, what do you pay? And you take, like, how do you also, and if you could speak to how it would be for someone who's just getting started, because I think that's a hard place to be in. You can't really say like, they're like, I'll offer you 300, and you're like 500. You just have to figure out, where you stand on that, I guess. But how do you handle that?
I think you should always ask for more than they offer you. Like, the worst they can do is just be like, no. And I regret not asking for more often. If you're like desperate to place a story because it's like super precious to you, sometimes, like, there was a woman I was covering who got killed by a drone strike, and I just like desperately want her story to be out there. So I took like $600, but normally I would say like, I just think you should ask for more and just be like, this is actually, this is my rate. Does that work for you? And if they say no, then you say, okay, like, fine, I'm willing to do it for less. And I also think you can grow with the publication. Like, maybe they pay you 50 cents a word at the start, but then after you've written for them for a year, you can be like, actually, can we move this up to $1 a word or 75 cents a word? And also like looking up what the rates are so that you know what publications charge. Like, there's now like Twitter accounts and spreadsheets that like say what places pay. So just you go in armed with the knowledge of what they normally pay.
Are there Twitter accounts that you are following that you think are particularly helpful? As everyone goes to their Twitter and hits follow.
I'm sure people know what this one is called, but I don't know. I'll look it up while Alyson's talking. I think it's yeah, I'll tell you. Alyson, do you get paid the same amount every time?
Yeah, I have a rate. I mean, the New York Times has a rate. It's not my rate. But I will say what's flexible with the New York Times is like it's per word, so you can kind of talk your way into longer stories. So like, I can't really get more than the rate that they're giving me, but I could be like, I think this story is bigger, or I always write longer than they want, which I mean, not that much longer, because then that's annoying for them. But if I get assigned like 1,200 words, I'll write like 1,400 words. And if they're all really good, they keep them in. And then all of a sudden you made like, a little bit more than you would have. But I agree, like, without, the Times aside, I've heard from everyone that no one has been able to negotiate with the Times about a rate. It's just fixed. But with other publications, I also would say like I would always ask more. Like, I got asked, I'm from Memphis, Tennessee, and I got asked to do like a guide to Memphis for like $200. And I was just like, no, like it was so much more below my rate. And they didn't have any budget to negotiate. But I've also like, I've heard of people like successfully getting more money, or like an editor will say, well, if you like want to do your own photos, we'll give you like, they make, a lot of them are willing to make it work with you. And I do agree with Liz, like if it's done in like a nice, polite way, I do think it shows that you value your work. Like, I don't see any downside to it.
Mm-hmm.
Unless it's your first article out of NYU. Like, I feel like that would be a little bit like arrogant. But like, if you do one, and then you do another, and then like you could ask them like, now I'm a little more experienced, is there more money for this? I would do it more that way right out of college.
And what do you think is an appropriate rate to ask for right out of college?
I mean, it's all just like market. It's like, I mean,
it all depends on the publication. The Twitter account I was talking about is Who Pays Writers, and it's just like a database of what everyone pays. So it's helpful to know that, because then you can know like this is what they pay. But obviously they pay different people different rates. So maybe you're on the lower end when you first start out, but then you can move up.
Yeah.
I also just say like, if it's too low, like I'm very honest with my editors. I'm like, I just can't, like, I have to pay my rent. Like, I can't. Because you're like the thing that's always frustrated me about freelance journalists is like a lot of them have another source of income. Like, a lot of them are like married to somebody who's rich, or their family's rich, or like for a lot of people treat it like a hobby. Like, and not everybody, there's some incredible professional writers, but I always found, especially at the beginning, like I was up against people who will write for free because they weren't really in it.
It makes it harder for the rest of us.
It really makes it. So that was like one thing I will say, I would never write for free, even when I was an undergrad. Like, people who wrote for like helping them, I just thought that was like a bad thing to put into the world. And, but a lot of writers will write for, or a lot of writers like, there's like travel writing is ridiculous because a lot of writers can take these like free trips. So they say, well, you could pay me $150 for the article because I just got sent to like the Maldives for a week, but like no other profession would say that. A lawyer wouldn't be like, well, you sent me to an amazing business trip. So no need to pay me. You know what I mean? Like it's a weird concept that a lot of journalists have. And I think it's, and I've seen it a lot, and I've seen it like for the whole 12 years I've been freelancing in different levels. I've seen it also from like older, more experienced people that they're like, I'm just doing this as a favor to an editor. So I'm like doing something for free. And I'm like, well, thank you so much. Cause I actually have to pay my rent.
Yeah. I'm sure students will have more questions about the pay because this is a thing I hear about a lot. We have 8 minutes till 6. At 6, we're gonna go to the students' questions, but I wanted to ask a couple of things. Do you have a template for pitching, or like I know you're not, Alyson, you're sort of texting, but what do you suggest to people as like sort of a quick template for how to pitch for both of you?
I would just start like one sentence like, "Hi, I'm Alyson Krueger. I'm a freelance journalist in New York," or like I'm in NYU in the magazine writing department. My work has appeared like ABC. Even if you've interned, you could say like, I've been interning at these places, like one sentence, and then say, I thought, I have an idea. I thought of you, and just say your idea in like 2 to 3 sentences, I would say. And then I always have like a little bit of another paragraph about why. Like, I think it would be good to write this now because it's ski season or falls upon us, or this news event just happened. And I always say why now, because that's like the one question editors really want to know. Like, it could be the best story, but if there's no news hook, it's like, it's a little weird to run it. So then, and then I always say like, this is just like the tip of the iceberg of what let me know if you need more information for this pitch. I kind of like tease things out, like instead of writing, but other people do it differently. That's personally what I do, because I think it's like easier to capture their attention, and then they're interested. You can write them a lot more and they'll read it.
And what do you use as this is another question I get a lot. What do you use as your subject line in the email?
Like story pitch : what did I pitch yesterday? Two guys are reclaiming apple trees. I like met these 2 guys who are trying to find like all these lost apple trees in Long Island, and they use it to make cider. And they're literally like clipping apple trees off the side of the highway that have existed for like hundreds of years. And anyway, so the subject is like, 2 guys trying to find every lost tree on Long Island to make cider.
Yeah.
Or whatever it is, So.
And then you're like, oh, what are they doing? And it's like enticing enough that makes you open, right?
But I always write story pitch, in the subject. Or if it's timely, like I'll write like timely story pitch. If it's about something happening in the next week or so, just so they know what they're dealing with.
Yeah. And what about you?
I think an important thing to consider is that editors get about 8 million emails and they don't like reading them. And so even for long form magazine pieces, like I'll often attach the longer pitch, but then summarize it. Like I would use the same format Alyson uses, like pitch with whatever the story is about, some compelling, subject line of what the story is about. I honestly don't think it matters. I saw someone had asked a question about having a .edu email. I think what matters is that you have a good idea and that you have access. And editors don't care if you're a student, they're willing to work with you if you have a really good idea, because what all of these magazines want are good, interesting ideas that no one else has. So I think I usually will write out what the idea is. For me, if it's a long form piece in like a paragraph, if you're pitching a magazine, or maybe a few sentences, and then I'll say like attached to the full pitch, because I'm guessing that this editor does not want to read my full pitch in the middle of his Tuesday when he's like having a like burrito or whatever. So then he can like look at it, think about it, and then like at his leisure on his iPad in bed, like look at the full pitch or whatever. Like, you have to like imagine who these people are, and like the New York magazine scene is still like white male dominated. Like you just have to imagine how they're receiving this thing that you're sending them. And like, I made a mistake recently with New York Times Magazine, which is I knew an editor who moved over there and she was like, oh my God, Liz, I would love to work with you, like pitch us whatever. And then I kind of got too casual because she was like, pitch us however, because the last story I pitched her when she was at a different magazine was verbal, and she just took it and we ran this long form of story based on a verbal pitch. And then I realized like New York Times Magazine is really formal. So despite her saying that, like she still wanted like formal pitches. And so like I pitched her a few times, they didn't really fly. And I kind of learned from that. Like it doesn't just matter the editor, it matters like the publication and learning about them and how they want to receive pitches. And so yeah, like when I pitch them again, I'll probably again go back to like, here's the pitch, here's the idea, and like attached as a formal pitch, you know, for that particular publication.
Yeah, I mean, and it's also like she might have to send that pitch around. Like she may like it, but she has to send it around to a whole group of people.
Yeah, it's not just her. It's like a whole, you know, in a lot of these places that you're giving a pitch to not just one person, but like 20 people.
Yeah.
And I agree about like saying, I mean, I always think like Liz is right that they want good ideas and they don't care if you're a student. I actually would like say why as a student you could do this story while no one else. Like yeah. I've been to this party 3 times, you know, so I know about it, or like I found it, or like my dad's friends is like whatever, you know, whatever your access is. I totally agree. I think that's a really good thing to write especially when you're starting off.
Yeah.
And then we'll go to questions, but I want to ask, this is the question I get the most. How long do you wait until after you pitch? How long do you wait to follow up until after your pitch? I guess you know what I mean. How long after you pitch do you wait to follow up if you haven't heard anything?
I follow up probably once a week, 3 times.
I follow up if it's a long form. Yeah.
Oh wait, I didn't hear you. I think you broke up. What did you say? Oh, can you hear me, Liz?
Yeah, now I can hear you. Yeah, I think if it's a long form pitch, they might need more time to read it. But if it's a shorter pitch, honestly, I think my internet connection is suddenly unstable. I'm not sure why, but I honestly follow up like sometimes a dozen times. And I don't worry about harassing people because I've followed up like 15 times. Like I did a story for the Village Voice where I emailed, no response. And I emailed 15 times. And then he was like, and so I just was like, okay, I guess, you know, you have to pitch and just persistently and be persistent.
I've also gotten yeses after multiple follow-ups.
And it's like you're waiting like a week in between following up each time?
About that. I mean, if it's timely, I'll follow up sooner. Like if it's timely, I'll follow up the next day. But I'll write. I'm like, sorry to follow up, you know, one day after I sent this to you, but the event's this weekend, you know, or I have the exclusive and I really need to tell them. Like I always like explain the compelling reason why I'm being annoying. Yeah. And like, you know, so I don't seem crazy. But yeah, if it's not timely, I would say probably once a week. And you know, also like, oh my God, the best thing I ever figured out was like when publications go to print, because you should not pitch that morning. Like they will not read it. So, right. You know, like Thursday afternoon and Friday morning at the Times is so hectic. Like they're trying to close the weekend issue. But like Friday afternoon is amazing because everything gets cut off at 1. So, you know, like if you figure out like and like some, you know, like Monday morning, I always thought it was like the most terrible time to pitch because everybody's catching up and, you know, from the weekend. And so like you can kind of figure out like when their downtime is or.
Right. Okay. A question from the students. So I'm going to summarize here, but how do you find the right editor to pitch? How do you go about that? I've talked to them about you sort of using your reporting skills to find the right person, but if you're just starting out, you guys know a lot of people already, but what do you suggest for students?
I always ask people, I'll trial and error. Like I'll pitch some, well, you can figure out, like, I mean, obviously you can always figure out what publication somebody works for. And usually through LinkedIn, I would say like I use LinkedIn a lot to figure out who the person is. And then you can kind of always figure out the email format for the company just by like, I always like guess and then Google it and then like see if it comes up, you know, and then if it doesn't, like try, or I'll even like send the same email to like 4 different iterations of the same, like first initial last name, first name dot last name, I'll try just last name and then like see which one sticks. But if I do get an editor and they say no, I'll say, is there a better person to pitch to about these types of topics?
That's
Like, I'll
great.
just ask, I'll be like, are you the right one to pitch this to? And if not, could you direct me?
Like for
Because I will say, like, even within the New York Times style section, it's the same section. Like if I pitch the party trend to the new mom who has 2 babies, like she doesn't care. Like she doesn't get excited about it. She's not going to say yes to it. So you kind of have to figure out like who is into why. And that's not online. That's just from like trial and error, and trying to kind of figure out. But definitely ask if they're the right person and if they have suggestions if they're not, because
sometimes you can also look at that person's Twitter feed and they're usually like, tweeting about the things they're interested in.
Totally.
You can kind
Yeah,
of see
that's
there through that.
a great idea. Yeah.
And also looking at what the publication has run recently, like a really like silly mistake I made early on was like pitching a story that they had done a similar kind of story on. So like obviously doing your due diligence on that, but like thinking about what that editor has commissioned and what they've run recently and like the kind of things that they haven't done, and been like, hey, like I noticed that you haven't covered this state since 2015. Like, have you considered doing a story on New Mexico? Because I have like this really interesting story out of there that they're almost missing out on this if they don't take your story.
Yeah, my other advice is like, I don't pitch to the main editor ever. Like I never pitch to like the editor in chief. Like I actually try to go as low as possible when I'm pitching to like, and you can see like there'll be like an associate editor, like even like an editor's not really an assistant, because that's a different thing, but there'll be like an assistant editor, an associate editor, or like the news editor versus the features editor. Like those are way better people to pitch to than the editor in chief. Of even of like a section, like even of New York Mag, like don't pitch the editor in chief of the Intelligencer, like pitch like the lower person.
They often don't have their stable of writers yet.
And they have more time to read your pitches. Like I'm kind of in this limbo right now where I got assigned a story from like an editor in chief and she just doesn't have time to get to it. And I keep thinking like, oh, if only I was working with like one of the underlings, it would have already been printed by now. Like you kind of get like hard when you're working with someone who's so busy a lot.
Another question is, like, what do you do for healthcare? What is the healthcare situation for both of you? Do you, like with insurance, I think. And then sort of related is, how do you take care of your mental health as you tackle sort of heavier stories, and how do you get yourself back out there again afterwards? So one is more, I guess,
I'll always take that. None of my stories are that heavy.
I think making really clear boundaries between your work life and your personal life is always good, but especially with heavier stories, like I do try to have a time of day that I stop working and I like do things that are helpful for me to like reset, so that I don't bring like the trauma that I work with to other people in my life, and like sit with it all the time. So whether that's like walking or running or like going out with the dog or, playing volleyball, whatever is the thing that you do, just like not looking at your phone in the evening is really helpful. For healthcare, I have to say, last year was my worst financial year ever. And they actually told me that I was so below the poverty line that my healthcare was free. But that is because I put thousands, and I mean like tens of thousands of dollars of like my own money into my reporting last year for my book. And so next year I think will be like my best financial year ever, but that's just like an indication of how unstable this can be. And I use like basically Obamacare in the marketplace. But yeah, you're on your own, and that can be really, really tough. Like it's no joke.
Yeah, I'm on Obamacare too. And like the benefit of being an independent contractor, which is what a freelancer is you do get to deduct a lot of your expenses. So you can get your income, the lower your income, the better your Obamacare deal is going to be, because there's subsidies and all that kind of stuff. So, like some people, I have like a really good Obamacare rate because, I've got a great accountant who kind of like gets my income down to where, not unethically, like, we just like expense everything, it's like, and so that's like a trick I've learned. But yeah, I mean, health insurance can definitely be really tough. But it's way better now than it was before
Yeah.
Obamacare. Like I remember those days.
Yeah.
Definitely expense everything. Like this office, I expense as part of my house. My car that I use, I expense. All of my trips that are often reporting trips, I expense everything. So like you really can do much better on your taxes that way and not have to pay so much. And it's totally fine and ethical to do so.
Yeah.
Someone is asking, are there resources you could direct folks to online for samples of pitches you think work well, or formal pitches and samples of good resources? So that is something I would like, I'm trying to find too for students. There are a lot of how to pitch guides that I think are pretty helpful, but have you seen really good pitches that you sort of go back to, and or maybe they're your own pitches, but do you have resources you look at for them?
I get a lot of good PR pitches. Like a lot of people hate PR people, but I like love them. I get great pitches from them. Like I'll be like, you nailed it.
And what is the formula that you think they're nailing?
Like I think if they come up with a really good, for me, it's like if they come up with a really good trend or a really good person for me to interview that's really timely. Like this person, we ended up not doing the story, but this PR person was like, there's this thing now called parent break, where after the kids go back to school, like, and they get settled, the parents like go on holiday and have their summer vacation basically. And she sent me like evidence. She had like stats in her pitch. She sent me like examples of hotels. I think one of her clients was a hotel, but like examples of hotels, like advertising themselves as a location for a parent break. She had like it was quick, it was timely, it included like stats, and it was something, it was like something I hadn't heard of that made perfect sense. I started texting all my friends with kids, like, do you do a parent break? Like, have you heard of a parent break? And they all had, like, so that was really cool because it opened my eyes to something that I wasn't aware of. But I could send, I've never seen a guide, like a guide, but I'm happy to send some of my pitches that have been accepted.
That would be great.
Yeah, if people, I'll have to like clean them up a little because I'm so casual, but I could send them to Whitney and she could spread them around to classes, or I'm happy to do that.
That would be great. Yeah, I think some people are looking for templates, or just like, this was a really good one. And that's a hard thing to find because people do it in so many different ways. But it's us, it's about, I sometimes say, think about what you would say to someone if you were just walking down the street and you're like, oh, hey, Liz, what's up? And you're like, what are you working on? You would probably tell me like the most interesting part of what you're working on, and to like think through that exercise as a way to write their pitch too. Because you will.
Exactly how I think of pitching. I'm like, I just heard the craziest thing. Like these people are doing this, and then this hotel is doing this, and then this celebrity got involved, and it's really like everyone's doing this thing, like I don't write it like that, but it is a little bit, for me, it's like generating excitement, in the pitch.
Yeah.
But with a lot of examples and with like the substance to back it up.
Yeah, you want to generate some urgency that this is like a really compelling thing that they should be dying to commission. But I also want to mention that a couple of publications do publish stuff about how to pitch them. So The Guardian, Jessica Reed, who's an editor there, she does like a How to Pitch to Me edition every year. California Sunday, which was a magazine that is now defunct, but like they did How to Break into California Sunday magazine. And I think like a lot of public magazines are doing that now. So you can kind of look that up and it's really helpful because then you get a window exactly into what the editor wants.
Yeah, and they do that like for this reason. Like I'm like, they're not just doing that as like a throwaway. It's like they really are trying to like make the pitches they're receiving better. So, and they put it out there for a reason.
Totally.
Another question is, what do you guys think about the Freelancers Union or other organizations that offer health insurance and assistance and networking? Are you involved in any of those?
I did join the union, but I didn't like the bureaucracy of it. I'm not gonna lie. So I guess I'm a really bad union member. And I haven't found any of the healthcare to be like what I was looking for. So I don't have anything good to recommend on that front. I think unions can be really helpful if you're not getting paid. and that some of the freelance journalist unions that are out there have been really good at forcing publications to pay people when they haven't paid them. So if you're in that kind of bind, I think like a union can be really helpful.
I
You know,
never dealt with the union, but I think, I mean, I think it's a good idea. Like Obamacare like made this all easier. I like if there wasn't Obamacare, I'd probably have to like turn to the union or something to get health insurance.
Another question is, how do you secure funding for projects abroad? And could you talk a little bit about fellowships and grants? Do either of you go that route?
I do so much, and it's so hard to get them, but once you get one, you get more. So I found like, I did one at NYU, which the travel reporting grant, if any of you guys have applied for it, if you haven't and you're still like first year, that's a really helpful thing. It gave me some money to go to India. Recently, I got the IWMF grant, which was like $10,000 from the International Women's Media Foundation. So that's really helpful for any women, female identifying people on this panel who want to do reporting abroad, Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting. And then I recently did one with Penn Criminal Justice Reporting Fellowship. There are a ton of fellowships. It can be really hard to get them. I think it's helpful to talk to people who have gotten them. So if you're interested in any of the ones I listed just now, you can definitely bug me and I'll give you like my tips. But yeah, once you get one, then the other ones kind of look at you like, oh, they think you're pretty. I also think you're pretty. So kind of like how it works, but definitely those can be good at filling in the gaps financially.
And someone else asked about managing different styles of writing with each organization. Like how do you manage that, or how do you like switch your brain to be like, okay, this is a different writing style? Yeah, I guess I think that's the question here.
My answer, I find it so hard. I really do. I don't know if it's because I'm so ingrained with the times, but I like really find it so hard to switch. Like I just wrote this huge magazine feature for Raw Report, and there was like so much red on it, and it was just stuff like, we don't use that word. Do you know what I mean? Like they don't use like the word like billionaire. You know what I mean? They use like high net worth individual. You know, like you just kind of have to learn. Yeah. I will say, so I have no good answer to that, but I will say like reading the publication helps a lot, and even just things like to know if like you identify someone by their last name or like Mr. So-and-so, you know, like you can kind of get little things by that by reading. But what I do, which is probably a cop out, is whenever I turn in anything to a new publication, I just like remind the editor that I'm new. Like I just, you know, I'll turn it in and I'll be like, thank you so much for the assignment. Like as promised, here's my piece. Like, you know, this is the first time I've ever written for you guys. So I'm very open to, you know, feedback on style. And I just kind of just remind them so that they can set their expectations correctly when they're reading it. And that goes, you know, I think it like goes a long way because they forget, you know, like they forget that you're not like somebody the other day, they were like, you write like a newspaper writer. And I was like, yeah, I am a newspaper writer. Like that's what I've been doing for 12 years. Yeah. You know, and it did, I was like, that's, and then she was like, oh yeah, right. That's why it sounds like that, you know? So it's just kind of like, I had to remind them a little bit, but definitely reading and not just with style, like with the ideas also, you know, publications like repeat ideas over and over and over again. So like the more you can read the publication you're pitching to, like the better you can get to know it. And I think the better chance you'll have of succeeding with them.
Yeah. I mean, and Liz, yours is so interesting because you're doing podcast, you're doing like different publications, but it's different mediums completely. And so, yeah, I mean, how do you think about your voice in that way?
You know, Rob Boynton with Literary Reportage has been saying for years that podcasting is the new long form journalism. And I was like, ugh, I don't agree. And then I'm doing it and I'm like, oh my God, this is like a better form of magazine reporting because you can actually like follow all these little rabbit holes and it's like more reflective of real life because like a magazine piece, you have like one angle and you're like pursuing that to the end. Whereas like a podcast can go in all these different directions, which is what real life is like. So I think it just allows you to like explore different things. The hardest for me is that I normally work alone and I'm good at working alone. And sometimes I'm bad at working in groups. And like like now I'm working collaboratively with the podcast, which is forcing me to be better at working collaboratively. And I think that's good. But it's like, yeah, you get set on one way of doing things. And yeah, you just have to ask a lot of questions. Like I keep saying to them, like, I've never done a podcast. Like, what do you need me to do? And they'd be like, in your interviews, please stop saying, like all the time, because it sounds like shit on audio. And I was like, okay, like whatever the case might be, you just need to like ask questions and be like Alyson said, I'm new, like feel free to correct me, like tell me what to do to make this better. And I think people are really responsive to that.
Do you, one question I wanted to ask is there something, well, two questions, is there something that you learned in school that you sort of keep coming back to over and over, whether it's an interviewing technique or something? And then the follow-up is there something that you wish you would have known back when you were at grad school that you, like, is there something you wish you would have known back then?
I would have kept everyone's email address, the speakers who came to the class. NYU is like so well connected. Like the speakers who come to your classes are the best journalists in the city. And I didn't save any of my notebooks, but sometimes I remember like, oh my God, that editor came to our class, like, and they gave us their email and I didn't even write it. Like, I didn't even save that. That's gold, And so I definitely would take advantage of that. And your professors, like like the NYU professors are so well connected. And, so like, so that, I mean, I don't know if that answered your question, but definitely like keeping all that information because that's key. And they remember, like I had someone email me the other day was like, you spoke in our class like 5 years ago. And I totally remembered, and
Yeah,
I was honored they remembered me, so it was like nice. We had like a little connection.
yeah, I tell people that over and over. I mean, that's a really good concrete thing. I mean, I'm like, yeah, collect all these email addresses.
Save them. Like don't like write them in your note. Maybe start like an email draft or something with them in Gmail or I don't know, because that is gold and that's not something you have in the real world. Like you never get to meet all those incredible journalists face to face like all the time.
Yeah.
So.
The one thing that I really remember all the time is David Samuels was a magazine writer who was teaching when I was there, and he said, what is in your brown paper bag? And what he meant by that is after you're done reporting a story, work with what you have and think about what you have. Don't try to shape a story around what you want it to be or what you think it was or what you think it could be. Like, look at what you have and build the story around that. Like that's building a story around reality. And a lot of times you even have to build a story around your weaknesses. Like, here's what I don't have in my brown paper bag. So therefore I have to say, like, for example, in this podcast, I can't go meet the person in prison because they blocked all visitors. And they're especially blocking me because I'm a journalist. They don't want them inside the prison. So then we're emphasizing the fact that we're talking to her only from jail and from on the prison calls, and that they are like especially harsh with visitation of this jail, and it becomes a strength that you don't have this because you're using it as part of the story. So I think about that all the time. What's in your brown paper bag? And I also think I wish I knew to find more mentors. Like I have a few amazing mentors from NYU and a few peers that we read each other's work, but I always could use more. So I try to mentor anyone who comes my way who wants it. And I see you're saying something about email addresses, Whitney, and totally fine to share.
Okay.
Yeah,
Or follow
definitely.
me on Twitter and bug me there or whatever.
Yeah, if it's okay with you, then can you just tell people on the now?
Oh yeah, it's just elizabethflock@gmail.com, my first and last name at Gmail, and it's at Liz Flock on Twitter if that's easier.
And mine's ALYSON.KRUEGER@gmail.
That's so nice. Thank you guys. Thank you so much. Someone asked here, we just have a couple more minutes, but do you have any advice for pitching a documentary? That would be for Liz.
It depends if you're pitching it based on a story you did. I think that's actually a really good way to get in the documentary world right now, is oftentimes they're buying pieces that are already written for a magazine. It could be a really small magazine. It could be a really big magazine. It doesn't matter. If you put a story down on the page, then they know the characters exist. You have access. here's the story, they can imagine it, and they often buy stories that way, and they'll pay you a certain amount of money to come on board as a producer and make it. So to me, that's the easiest in to making a documentary. If you try to do it from scratch, like just like, hey, I have an idea, it's much harder to get funding for it. So what will happen is you publish the magazine piece or even a shorter piece, and then you would reach out to a production company, you know, or you try to find an agent who can help you do that. But like, you can email the story to a production company and be like, hey, I see you do these kinds of documentaries. I just published this piece on this subject. If you're interested, like, let me know. And then oftentimes they'll like purchase the rights to that documentary and you can work with them to make it. So that's how it's been working for me. And I think there's kind of a gold rush in the documentary world right now for those kinds of, for magazine pieces to be turned into docs.
And so this question is sort of, I'm gonna like change it slightly, but how does they're wondering like, what about your time at NYU? And so like, is there something that during when you were here that you're just like, oh, that was so helpful? Or I mean, somewhat similar to the one I just asked you, but is there a class that you find particularly helpful, or are there things that you took from it? I think, you know, a lot of people are about to graduate and they're like, okay, what am I supposed to make of all this that I just did this? And how am I supposed to use that as a springboard, I guess?
I actually thought NYU was like really great at mirroring the freelance journalist life, because you're writing so many different types of articles for a lot of different classes at the same time. And so I would just say, like, I think people overthink it when they go into the real world, you know, or like when they're pitching big publications. Like, it's no different from being in class. You just don't have like a professor to edit it before you turn it in, but you have your editors, you know? So, you know, I would say, like, you know, take that with you. Like, NYU is like really good at preparing you, you know, for like writing these articles. And, you know, I think it's not that much different in the real world. You're just getting money for it instead of a grade, you know, but the process is, or at least the classes I took, like, we had to pitch ideas and then we had to write them and then we had to edit them again. And, you know, it was very good at setting me up for success, at least. And
yeah,
That's great.
I think one thing I wish I'd realized was that NYU was this like amazing resource to help edit my pieces more before they went out to editors. So like, I wrote my first book while at NYU and I was like, wow, this is not as hard as I thought. And then now I'm writing my second book and I don't have any professors to look at it. And I'm not going to burden my friends with like my 300-page book. So I'm just like, oh my God, I'm writing this in a vacuum alone. And then I'm going to send it to my editor and no one has even seen it. Like, this is a nightmare. So I think, like, if you have a book idea, like, start writing it now at NYU. Like, if you have magazine ideas, like, pitch, like, do them in your classes, like, get that. You're paying a lot of money to be there, like, use it and like get your teacher's feedback, because it's so amazing to have that, like, in that time, you know?
I will never forget the first article I turned in, because I also started freelancing at NYU. The first one I turned in after I graduated, and my editor was like, wow, like, your quality went down a little bit with this one. And I was like, yeah, that's because it hasn't gone through like 6 drafts with the professor.
Right?
You know, it was fine. We moved past it. It was fine, but it just makes me laugh when I think about that.
Really.
I also will say, like, stay in touch with your, like, you know, I'm sure your class is incredible. Like, you know, my class from NYU is doing the most interesting things, and some of them now are editors who assign me things, you know, so I would, you know, stay in touch with people and like share what you're doing. And you definitely can help each other out a lot, and like share editor names and share information about pay. And I think having that support is really a incredible thing when you leave.
Thank you. And one more question, and then we'll let you go. But this is something that's come up several times with students, is there, you know, like, I think that's part of the challenge with my role a little bit, is that students are working on pieces in their class, and then they're trying to then take whatever, you know, like, it's a 3,000 word piece and then they're trying to pitch it. So like, how do you structure pitches for stories that you've already drafted in class? You know, it may not, and, you know, and I think sometimes it doesn't fit what, you know, you're like, I want this to go in the cut, but it's probably not going to work for them because of the assignment. So how do you make that transition?
I think never pitching a finished piece. Like, I made that mistake recently. Like I worked on this 5,000 word piece for my Penn Criminal Justice Fellowship, and I was like, I don't want to write a pitch, so I'm just going to pitch it as a full piece. And then it's been rejected a bunch, and I'm pretty sure it's because I pitched them a finished thing. And editors want to feel like they can put their hand on it, and they don't want to feel like you're giving them a finished thing. So I just like, now I'm like, okay, Liz, start over and write your pitch. And like already I'm getting more responses of interest. And I think like whatever you write for class, like just set that aside, start over, think about the publication you want, and then write them a pitch that feels right for them. And unfortunately, you're writing it twice, but it can help you, to learn how to approach a story 2 different ways, even if it's more work, and that's frustrating.
I was gonna say, I would not tell them you finished it for class.
Yeah, never tell them it's done.
Yeah. Yeah, I've had bad experiences also trying to pitch finished pieces, because it makes them, it's like not personal to that magazine. They don't want to feel like you're just like filling in the holes, or whatever. So I would just like ignore the fact that you already wrote it, like take the idea, pitch the idea, and then if they want it, like pull from, like you've got all that reporting. Like it's not going to be that hard to reconfigure it and put it into a story that fits, but you kind of have to start over a little bit.
Yeah. Is there, I think we can leave it here, but I just wanted to see if there was anything you felt like we didn't cover, there any advice you wanted to give at the end. Yeah, anything else you'd wanted to tell the students?
I would just say, like, being young is such an advantage in journalism, because every editor, no matter which publication it is, wants to know what the young people are doing, and they want to know what the new thing is, and they want to know like your take on things. And they're old, like most of the editors you're working with, they're not, they're not old, but they're older than you, so I would approach, like, look in the mirror and be like, yes, I want to write for them, but they need me. Like, you have power, as a young journalist, and they need your stories just as much as you need them to assign them. Like, I'll never forget, one editor was like, I need stories. Like, I have like 2 sections to fill every single week. And she like changed the way I thought, because all of a sudden it was like, oh my God, she really needs me, like she needs my ideas. And I became less like feeling like I was this like subservient person to her who was like begging to have my stories written. Like, it's like, no, it's like this amazing mutual thing where they need your stories and you want to write for them. And like, it's all really wonderful. And I would really focus on, like your surroundings and your thoughts and your expertise, because that young perspective is like, I mean, I'm only 37, and like I get asked by my editors all the time, like, what do the young people think about this? And I'm like, I don't know. Like, I don't really need any 21-year-olds in my life, or 22 or 25, and but every story I write, everybody wants to know what the Gen Zers think. And so you really just like, don't forget how valuable you are when you're pitching. Like, go forth with confidence and know that you're needed. Like, your skills and your ideas are really needed. So
yeah, and I would just say, kind of adjacent to that, as a freelancer, you have freedom. And I think don't be afraid to like carve out the kind of life you want to have. Like, I've lived in like 10 cities since I've been freelancing, and moved around the world, and lived in a van, and lived in the middle of nowhere. And like, the world is so remote and Zoom oriented these days. Like, you can find interesting stories anywhere, and maybe you just want to stay in your hometown, whatever it is, but like, don't be afraid to like carve out the kind of life that you envision for yourself, and kind of build your journalism career around it. Because I think that's also how you find the stories that are like right for you and what you're interested in. So yeah, I think just like, I don't know, embracing that freedom as a freelancer. But I would also say it is helpful to work in publications, and I don't think I would be as good a freelancer as I can be at times if I didn't work in publications. So I do think it can be helpful to spend a few years working in a newsroom, if that makes sense for you. And then, you can always split up your life doing that part of the time, and then being a freelancer another part of the time. And it helps with the money aspect.
Yeah. Thank you both so much. This was so great. I feel excited, and I'm sure the students do too. And I really, really appreciate you taking the time. So thank you. I'm clapping for everyone that's out there. And I will email you guys separately, but thank you again. See you later.
please email all of you if you need anything. Please
Yeah.
just
Please
And
do.
follow up if you don't hear from me.
Yeah, once a week for every week.
That would be good times.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.